Hi, welcome to the ChicoBag podcast, where we talk with people who are working to leave the world a little bit better than they found it through the businesses they build, the ideas they share, and the stories they tell. Because stories, that's what people care about. And what people care about is what shapes the world and what the world becomes. So today's guest understands that better than most. Kevin Willard, he's a creative director and copywriter who has spent more than 2 decades helping organizations find stories that actually move people. His work spans purpose-driven organizations like the American Forest Foundation, Ocean Conservancy, the U.S. Committee for Refugees, as well as global brands, including Hyatt, State Farm, and Jack Daniels. He's the owner of Assembly, a brand storytelling studio, and someone who believes that the best creative work doesn't just sell products, it helps people see the world differently. Kevin, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here. Been fan of ChicoBag and what you guys are up to for a while now. So it's great to be able to sit down and just hash it out.
Yeah. Storytelling is so powerful, and anyone listening to this who's trying to build a brand or build a movement, like, knows that, gosh, it's hard to break through, hard to reach people in this environment. So how would you describe the current environment as far as getting people's attention, and what are you seeing right now as being the playing field for marketers?
I'm seeing a scramble. I think a lot of people are just trying to see what works and what doesn't. I think we're trying to, catch up with the latest in, AI tech, and we're losing, and we have been losing ground on, who we really are. The brands that are winning are the ones who are, staying true to themselves. And I think that becomes the fundamental sort of issue is we don't know what we're doing out there a lot of times. And so we are just spraying mud at the wall and seeing what, people react to, just responding to quick social trends and other things. And what we really need to be doing is just looking inward and defining who we are through the work that we do. And if we're able to do that in an honest, genuine way, then I think, that's the stuff people care about.
I've been thinking about it, like, things have changed a lot. Right? When I think about, before everyone had a cell phone in their hand, like we would sit in, the dentist's office and like look at, magazines and flip through and see ads and, stare at the wall and, notice, whatever advertising there was, around the office. It's just one example, right? But now, we're all competing for people's attention, right? They call it the attention economy. Um, what How do you break through? So, we're all trying to throw mud at the wall. Can you tell us, like, what are you learning as far as the the brands that have the ability to break through to get people's attention? What are they doing?
I mean, one of the reasons why I even started Assembly is I think the best brands are doing are they're creating content people seek out. And they're creating stories that they're they're creating fans that are interested in. And Huckberry does a great job with their series Dirt. North Face has always done a wonderful job telling their stories of, adventure and overcoming, giant feats. And I think we seek those things out if we're watching, if we're flipping through YouTube or watching those are the things like I'll go to and watch, and like I don't care if it's put on by a brand or all, so I think that's really what's standing out to me is creating return. This idea that if I'm telling a story or creating environment, will someone come back to it because they were entertained, because they were inspired, and that's hard to do. But it's not as hard as most brands probably think. They just have to invest, the time into the slow growth that like a YouTube channel does. Most of them already have so many different hundreds of thousands of fans. If you're a bigger brand, if you're a smaller brand, great place to start. I know that Huckberry started with like 10,000 followers on their YouTube channel, and by investing in series driven content, they're up, right next to North Face, up at like 450,000 followers inside of like 2 or 3 years with their show. And so it's great to see things like that, because then it starts to turn advertising into less advertising and more into entertainment. And that's what, I'm, strongly behind.
So your example of Huckberry. So what are they doing exactly? Are they're creating like a TV show or?
So they have a series. So I mean, they've turned their YouTube channel into their own media hub. And so by creating this series called Dirt, and Huckberry is a brand that has, products that are curated from, places all over the world, and um, served to customers through their website and packaged up in a way. And so it's obviously very interesting to sort of dig into, like Anthony Bourdain style, kind of like dig into, just have a producer, a director, and a shooter, and you're going out to the places where these products are invented, made, created, and you're meeting the people, you're eating the food, you're exploring the interesting environment that's there. I mean, that's not a format that, I mean, that's a proven format that works great for lots of different types of content, because people are naturally curious about other people. And if you can do that in a way that draws people into your world, then it starts to establish that brand trust, or it becomes a show that you want to come back to and watch, or even binge. And so and they'll do a bunch of different things. So they'll take their 20-minute episodes, and then they'll do spin-offs. So they'll do like what's in the bag, and the director will do an episode on what she had brought with her on the trip, and like those sorts of specific things. So that's a whole series below that. And then they can take snippets of that product stuff and talk more about it there. And so if you go to their YouTube channel, you can really see how they're starting to really kind of create pillars for their content, but it's all driven by one bigger, one bigger umbrella sort of Dirt series that creates this churn of great content that also advances their brand, helps sell their products, does all that stuff, but doesn't feel like any of that.
And that's I mean, it seems like that's the gold standard, right? So what's I mean, it sounds expensive, first of all. So for smaller brands that are trying to
Well, let me
do.
stop you. It's not expensive, because when you think about what you would spend, so if you would take about and depending on what your marketing budget is or what you want to spend on it, they took all the money that they were going to spend like on paid media, and they just invested it into their business and their series and their owned channels. And so that becomes a shift in spend, not necessarily an additional one and a different way to look at something. And so I guess you just have to look and see, hey, what did I spend on marketing this year? What are
Mhm.
and then what could I? Are there other things I can do that work harder? To
Yeah.
so. But
So yeah, so that kind of gets into measurement. So how do you know when something is working, right? When you think about traditional advertising medium, you're doing Google ads or what have you, there's known metrics. As far as content, like how do you know if a content's working? Is it just views?
I think it depends on what your product, what you're selling or what your goals are. If you're going in and the best part about, like, for instance, like the social space, and if you're creating reoccurring content, if that's something that you're doing, you can create something and then continue making, spinning off that or making other things. But maybe then someone's drawn to your page from something you made way further down the line, and then they find that first thing that you made and they start watching that too. So it's not over. And I think what marketing is these short flash in the pan things that we, through seasonal campaigns, through other things, and we're the industry love, like the advertisers, we we love that because we like to take, your money every season or every time and be able to say, oh, you need a refresh, or oh, we need to do, it's Halloween, so let's rethink, our strategy or whatever it is. And so I think it's fundamentally that. I don't I may have gotten off track a little bit, but that's sort of what.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, we're talking about measurement, right? So it's,
Yeah.
it's more about what I'm hearing is you creating good content that people want to watch.
Yep.
And I know a lot of, brand people are building brands or movements, they're like, oh, we need some video content, right? And they create a video, um, and then it gets no views or it gets very few views, or it's just their family and friends that are watching it. Like, and there's, it's just a big waste of time, energy, and money. What,
Yeah.
from a storytelling perspective, and you have a lot of experience in this, like what makes a video a good video? Like, can you break down the framework of where people get it wrong, maybe, or how do you do it right?
Those are great questions. I want to circle back to the measurement thing just 1 second, because I don't feel like I answered that as clearly as I could have, or to elaborate on the fact that I think, views and all those things are important. I think when you can garner a following, that, people are you going to watch something that had 2,000 views, or are you going to watch the thing that with like 5 million views? And I think if you're able to sort of garner and grab and get that following going, then you can look at, the, like, that's impact. We had 50,000 we've 50,000 followers here, and now we have 100,000 over this period of time. And so that's one way to look at it. I think you can also tie it back to sales and other things too, that whatever sort of metrics you want to lean into. The other things I would be careful about is just that 80% of all content that even gets uploaded to the internet, to your later point, like, does not get watched, does not get seen. Especially on YouTube, there's like, I'm gonna probably screw up these numbers, but it is a 2.5% like place where like the the top two, the top, let's just say 10%, just for the sake of it, like top 10% getting the views, getting the things, but all the other people are not. And a lot of it can come down to like your distribution strategy. You can't just put a video up on the thing and feel like, a million people are going to come and watch it. But what I believe in, if you can tell a really great story, people will find it, people will share it, and people will watch it. You just have to be willing to kind of go there. So
Yeah. So let's get into what makes a video compelling, people want to watch versus, something that people won't come back to.
So great question. And I think we just have to look at it first. Like, if a story isn't interesting without a brand, it won't become interesting because of the brand.
Hmm.
Right. So,
Yeah.
so the work has to start with something fundamentally watchable: characters, stakes, curiosity, emotion, entertainment. Those things aren't decorations. They're like the engine of a good story. And I think, and honestly, even being a copywriter, before I really got into, and I could just write, I could always write and tell stories, and some of these things came naturally, for me, but it's not anything I've ever really like dissected until I really got into like helping clients see, their potential in their stories, and how could I articulate that back. And so that became something I had to really like dig into. And I was like, man, you're right. Like, a lot of times we have pretty pictures of pretty people, and they're doing these things, but we don't know anything about them or their lives. We don't know, um, you know, what's at stake, what they want. We aren't satisfying that curiosity. We're kind of just telling people stuff. And so think about all the great stories that you read or tell. There was a beginning. I did a series once that was like about the best beginnings, and that was just more in books. But there was one that stuck out to me. It was for Charlotte's Web, and it was, the first sentence in the book is, Where's Papa going with that axe? And it's sort of like, and it's a great kind of draw to you in. It's very thoughtful and intentional about how you're kind of grabbing your audience. And these days, like, we kind of, what's the hook? What's the hook? And we all follow, like, and I say we, but there's a format that people believe they have to follow, or there's this thing that everyone else is doing that they think they have to, like, sync with, or they're told this, or someone else's playbook told them this other thing. And I think that's where it goes, like, a little bit astray. If you're able to, really identify, and that's where, like, great storytelling comes in, or like just having that help, is that, hey, what's my character here, and what do they care about? Especially in impact storytelling, when we're talking about corporations or businesses going into places and making an impact. A lot of times I see that stuff is buried on the 47th page of an impact report that exists in the back corner of their website. And if you really were to look at those things, I mean, a lot of those organizations are doing really great things out in the world. And instead of telling those stories, they point the camera in a completely different place and fabricate an environment in a world that is less connected to the things that they do. And then, to me, that just drives me, like, I want to just be like, there's other stories here, and they're better than the ones that you're telling, if we can just figure out where to point the camera and make it about the why they're doing it, who they're impacting, all that stuff. So
I like that first line on Charlotte's Web. I mean, it's compelling. Where's Papa going with the axe? So, so is there, when someone's looking to tell a good story, like, what other rules, of thumb do you know of that could help people tell a good story?
no, man, it's all the time. It's vulnerability. It's like, where's the truth? How much there's the surface, right? And like,
Mm-hmm.
most, and I think that's the issue, like, most brands kind of, like, their stories are at the surface, or they don't go, they create this world and they just kind of live there, which works if you're specific brands. But if you're trying to earn, trust and respect of your customers and build that affinity, I think you got to do something that goes like here. And so you got to go, like, and not just a little bit lower, like, you got to be willing to kind of go there. And I think that is the place, because that's where the tension lives, whatever that thing is. And you can go there and do it. I mean, brands do that a lot when they pick fights with other, I don't know, Burger King fights with McDonald's about something, or there's interesting sort of scenarios that just pop up that create that natural tension, because unfortunately, I guess the way you see it is not even unfortunately, but, like, great stories need enemies. And so, what's your enemy? What's your thing? Like, for you, your enemy's plastic waste, right? And
Yeah.
so that's what you're fighting against. And once you have that thing that you're fighting against, you have that tension that sort of exists, and then you're starting to build up that. I mean, my enemy is advertising, not advertising the way that it's mostly my enemies, like the bad advertising, the stuff that's out there that doesn't feel like entertainment, the stuff that interrupts you, that's in your face, and that stuff. And it was scary for me to sort of, as an advertiser, as to create a company around, business around the fact that, like, advertising sucks, and we got to figure out a different way to make it, better. I think that's going to I'm sure it turns a lot of people away, or like, what's this guy talking about? He's making advertising, and no, I'm not. Sometimes, at least. But, I think, 10 years ago, brands could interrupt people and still get away with it. I think today's audiences have total control over what they watch. And if something isn't interesting, it's going to disappear instantly.
It's interesting the way things are shifting, right? And I've read a really good article that talked about, this idea of yeah, what you just mentioned, advertising that you could tolerate, right? It's like that, can you tolerate it? And then, we all live in this world now that you can just skip the ad after it plays for 5 seconds. And that's the new world. And when I go to traditional broadcast TV, which I occasionally do, I am so annoyed and irritated that I have to watch the whole commercial.
Yeah.
That is being played, and it's infuriating where I don't even want to do it. But I do on YouTube. Like, I find myself sometimes watching the whole ad, and I'm like, whoa, I just watched this whole ad. I didn't skip it. So that's what we're going for, right? We're going for the content that you're not skipping, because we all have control over this. So, and you talked a little bit about, I mean, you talked a lot about, what makes a good story. But I think as just everyday viewers of content, like, I don't really understand what makes a good story. I want to tell a good story, but I fundamentally don't understand it. The arc of a story, right? So you've identified, oh, you need a villain or an enemy, you need tension. What are the other elements, that a traditional story, would follow? Like, what's the next step after, you identify you have a villain and there's tension, and and
Well,
then
so it
uh,
depends
and
on
then
what
the honesty, right?
you're right. And so it's just the next step would be, all right, let's make, it's always what, what's the desired thing? Like what do I want, and what's in my way, and how do I get it? What's in my way? Those are the obstacles. And then how do I overcome those obstacles to get what I want? And am I going to get what I want, or am I not going to get what I want? And what other sort of it? And so it's just sort of like thinking, um, really fundamentally just about, I don't know if you're looking at a story arc, or I think that's the important thing when and then it's just isolating those things in a way that that just really start to dissect. And it sounds more complicated than I think it is, using a word like dissect. But it's almost really just looking at, is this falling flat? Like, am I feeling anything? Do I feel like I went along on a journey, or do I feel like someone just is spewing information at me? And I think that just becomes default. So I think what we have to, we have to find those ways of just being able to introduce that vulnerability. And the tension could come in a lot of different forms. If I want to talk about, depending on what it is that I'm like, what my goals are, it's hard to speak like ambiguously about, generalizing about what specific brands are doing, or not doing, in order to tell a great story. The things I see are just the stuff that just starts in the middle and stops, and that's most of what advertising is these days. And I think when we get into the creator world and the story driven sort of backgrounds in some of those environments, I think then we can get, I don't know, when you start to ask the question, did anyone actually want to watch this? Then, and that's when you like realize that you're not measuring desire anymore. You weren't measuring desire, you were measuring for survival. And I think that's sort of the most interesting stuff has always been the stuff that's not advertising.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what advertising's been doing is just sort of holding on to its legacy. And like you said earlier, like when you're sitting around in a dentist's office and you used to be able, you're not looking down at your phone, you're sort of like looking around at the pictures on the wall or the magazines in front of you, and you're getting, and they're kind of like just, you're present in that sort of way. Thinking about the cavity that you're just going to get filled, and staring at a picture of someone smiling pretty on the wall. And we lose that we lose that kind of physical presence with the world, as we consume into our phones. And it becomes more challenging for marketers to find ways to stand out. But think about podcasts that do a really nice job, or any that, like, those are creating return people. They're building followings, and and that's because the things they're talking about are interesting. It does suck when you have to listen to, a 30-second or 45-second thing in the middle of it that's like not related to what it is that you're doing, or those people have to like plug this thing. And I think we got ways to go in terms of like finding better ways to balance how advertisers come into that podcast world and help build that up. Because really what we're just turning podcast people into is just like talking head, commercials that just erode trust pretty much like immediately. We still tolerate it because we know that, the game is like they need to get paid. That's how they make their money. And I think there's more natural ways to do that. But yeah.
Huh. So what's the kind of worst storytelling advice that you see organizations following today?
Not telling them is probably the first thing that comes to mind. There are a million of every organization sitting on a pile of amazing human interest sort of stories. They have employees with interesting backgrounds. They have failures they should expose. They have wins in different ways. They're doing good things out in the world, and they're not pointing the camera at it. They're talking about it through the lens of themselves and not necessarily like the people maybe they're impacting. And I believe there's a lot of good in the world, and we're not very good at kind of exposing those things, because we're scared of what that might trigger for our business. There's lots of walking on lots of eggshells to not offend somebody. We want to be all things to all people, and the second if you start to think about, hey, I'm just talking to this one person, and
Yeah.
and you're able to do that in a really interesting way, you gotta venture to guess that there are other people like that person, and there's going to be people not like that person, and they're not going to like your stuff. They're going to say whatever it is that they want. Let them do that. Focus on your core, and that's just going to sort of like build out from there. But I think the second we start worrying about how we're um, pleasing or not pleasing everybody, it starts to get very, very bland very fast.
I I run into that situation a lot, where we're asking all of these people like, what do you think? What do you think? And then, we end up with, instead of Rocky Road, vanilla. And yeah, I actually am a fan of vanilla, but it's boring.
Can you think of like is there an opportunity, like, take me down that lane for a second? I want to unpack what it is, just like how that works. Is
Oh,
I mean, it
like when
definitely works. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it's very similar, like just coming out with different types of bags, right? So a lot of times we'll create a print series on a bag, and we want to create, something compelling, something that people love. And as soon as we like get a committee involved of, what do you love? Everyone's got their opinion. And then the thing that everyone can agree on really is the boring bag. Whereas some of these other ones, um, could really be, you know, really good selling bags because people love them, but they get squashed in committee, decision making.
And I think where I've seen, and that makes and that happens in every organization and every place on earth. The second you do like, hey, let's decide by a committee, and it's because it's easier to sort of dissolve that responsibility and pass that on to everybody. So then it's like, oh, we all failed, instead of, I don't want anybody to. It comes from a place of fear. I don't want to play. I don't want this on me specifically, but like giving someone ownership over those sort of decisions can be really effective. Another thing I've seen is, or we do, is like create a space for risk, create a space. Just, it doesn't have to be your entire business model, but it can be 10% of something that you're doing. You should always be thinking in that way, like, well, let's do something, like, let's acknowledge that we need to do something that makes us a little bit nervous, because if we're not making ourselves nervous, we're kind of just, then we're staying invisible and no one cares about us. We're not unique to anybody. We are just another bag that you can put over your shoulder or whatever.
Yeah.
And so if you create that little space for risk, be like, you have your run of your regular things, and
Yeah.
but it's like, here we're taking, define what that looks like for your, organization. Agree that risk is something you need to sort of step into, and then that becomes the like mantra when you kind of go into this to this section. So then it reframes everybody, even if it is like a committee, it reframes their sort of brain when they're going into it, because they're not looking at it from a general perspective. They're looking at it from like, hey, this is the risk we're taking, and it's just like taking little steps in that direction that creates, over time, it creates, more bold thinking inside organizations, and it makes people feel safer.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Is framing it so that people feel safe to take risks. And I think that's yeah. And the thing that come to mind, and just through that process, the conclusion I came to is the whole definition of compelling. If you want to make something compelling, by definition, there's going to be people that love it, and there's going to be people that hate it, right? So when you have something that's compelling, it's you're going to have people on that spectrum. So and it's okay that some people don't like it.
Yeah, to say like that's just all part of it. Like if I've worked on done some workshops with organizations where we've done that very specific sort of like exercise, and it's okay if you don't like it. It's probably a good thing. If everybody loves this, then I don't know if we're taking like the right sort of risk here. And you can pick out the people in the room who are gonna like, I don't know, there's more general sensibilities inside people, like, and just more risk, averse versus those other ones. And if those people if the risk averse people are not happy, then maybe that's a good thing. But
Yes.
but I think, yeah, it's just about creating that space and figuring out how to make it work for even inside big organizations can do it. So
Yeah. So let's talk about honesty. So, I know a lot of brands and storytellers are afraid, to be vulnerable, to be honest, to kind of expose their mistakes they might have made or the learning, but those are really good stories. So how do you get past the fear of just admitting that you did something that, wasn't the best option at first?
I mean, I think honesty for a lot of people, especially like I can speak from like personal experience of just like, you don't want to project confusion. You don't want to like, you don't want, we're all, that I use the word scared, fearful. Um, I think this does boil down to a level of fear, or of just, what, just even from like, the grade school scenario of like, if I if I have if I bring if I wear this pink hat to school, what are all the guys going to see? What are they going to say about me? And you start to think, you're just always sort of like worried about what people will think. And I think, and that's why we sort of like mask the reality. That's why it's safe to be on the surface. But when we stop, the most powerful things you can see out in the world, and even just in how, what topics people talk about or are willing to go or share, like the second there's that vulnerability there, that's the stuff I want to read. That's interest, that's the things that are interesting. There's too many stories that live on this in this middle area. So it's actually easy to stand out if you're willing to take that risk to do so. So, I mean, but like, I think it's a gradual process. I think, you start to be like, all right, I'm sick of telling this story. I'm sick of like this isn't getting the reaction I wanted. I need to go deeper. And you put that pressure on yourself of like, okay, I need to be vulnerable. And I think it's easier for people like creatives in marketing and advertising world, or even in film or anything else, because we're it's hard, but it's still, we're used to people not liking the things that we do. We're used to not we like when we love it when, you know, it's well received and it's something great, but you know, sometimes it's not, or sometimes nobody talks about it, or you know, it's this invisible thing. And I think we realize pretty quickly that, you know, we just try again, and then we try again, and and we keep going, and we just, you know, I think there's that fear of like wanting to get everything right on the first time and be as pristine as possible, but imperfection is tension. People like, um I want to know, we want to know your struggles, and we don't want to know your struggles after you've already succeeded or whatever, because that just like kind of takes away the part of the story. Maybe there's a part of you that you can, or your brand or business, or you know, inside you, that you want to expose, that you're confused about, you know, you know, that you don't, and you don't have the answers, but you want to make it known that you're going through something. You know, it's easier to talk about stuff after it's finished. It's harder to do it while it's happening. um
Yeah, I
and
was just going to ask that. So you talked about a story needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. So if you're exposing a mistake, do you need to have a happy ending, or can you just say, like, I'm still struggling, I haven't figured it out?
yeah, so that's your, like, I think so, depending on what is, let's make up something. Uh, can't think of something right now that
Well,
we're
let's see. I could probably give you an example from my business, right? So,
okay.
let's see. Let me get vulnerable here. So, um, I
I,
haven't figured it out. So we make high quality, long lasting products. Some right now in the marketplace, virgin material is cheaper than recycled content. So we've have been transitioning out of virgin material but into recycled content, but it's at a higher price premium. So we haven't necessarily totally figured out the how to play in a marketplace that rewards, kind of this consumption, the cheap, instant thing that may not last as long, right? When you're looking at bags, do you want to buy the $3 bag or the $10 bag?
yeah.
That is the, I guess, the confusion, right? And when people see it, they're like, oh, this is a cheaper one, that's the better one, right? Without thinking about, anything beyond that. So that's something that I don't know if it's a good example, but
No, it's a great example, because of this, like, you're in this place, you're trying to figure it out. And I think the vulnerability comes in. It doesn't necessarily, I think your story arc is, here's where I've, here's where we started, here's who I am right now. I'm not sure where it's where it's ending, but maybe what you're doing is asking others to, you know, help you find that ending. And then when you do, you know, or so, if you were telling the story of this and you were asking, I mean, there has to be, you know, lots of other hundreds and thousands of other organizations. I mean, this is not a new thing, right? Like, I have to spend more money on a better product, and but that's going to require people to pay more for it, and that's why manufacturing left, you know, the United States and went over places where it can be done cheaper. Not that it, um, and that's, I think the harder part of like trying to bring things, you know, into a place where, you know, people are, you know, want to pay more money for something that, you know, has a name attached to it that um means something. They know, they're more familiar with your process. Maybe you are like, maybe exposing that story. I think you should think of like the story itself of what you're telling, and like the conclusions other people will make based on that. And that sort of completes sort of like the narrative. And then eventually you're going to have an end to that story. And that just becomes, you know, um, part three of your, you know,
yeah.
part series, or four or five. And you don't have to, it's, so not everything has to, it could be a chapter instead of, you know, the end of your book. And especially in business, it's like,
Yeah.
when is like, there's, it's never, you're still writing the book pages every day. if you think of it like an author, like you're just, you're on whatever page you're on and you don't know when the book's going to end. Um, and maybe it does it. You're the author of your own never ending book until,
Right.
you know, uh,
Yeah. As far as storytelling, on a personal level, I've recently, discovered, that, when something happens in the past, right, you tell yourself a story about it. Right. And then you continue telling yourself a story about it. But I think from just a personal growth perspective, it's fun to go back, and look at a situation and then retell the story, right? So, the story keeps evolving. What I know now, is different than what I knew then. So the story's different. So I could retell essentially the same events, but with different meaning and a different conclusion.
yeah, I mean, that's a great way to look at it. Cause I think maybe we all feel that way. You can think of like when you started your business to where you are now. I'd venture to guess you'd say you are more equipped, less confused than you were when you started. um, and we're all going to find different challenges along the way. And I think there is that vulnerability of like, yeah, like well, what it feels like when you're in something and what it feels like when you can even step outside of it and look back down at it. And like what that reflection that you're talking about, like how does that influence or change or give you a different camera angle at the same situation to kind of expose something new.
Yeah. So back to the truth, right? So we talked a little bit about, do you have to tell the whole story with a happy ending? And I'm hearing no, you can tell folks you're struggling. It could just be a chapter in the larger story, especially if you have an engaged audience, right? Um, I always have a challenge of like, how do I tell that really the world's complicated. Supply chains are complicated. The issues that we're trying to solve from as a mission-based company are all complicated. A lot of times people, don't have the attention span to fully understand, the full picture of all the things at play. So how do you simplify a story and a message into something that's digestible when you're talking about something really complex and nuanced?
I think the biggest mistake a lot of marketers or just businesses make is they try to tell too much of that story at one time and really figuring out smart and strategic ways to kind of parse things out. Um, or just a good long look in the mirror of like what, we go back to like, will someone care about this? And and if the answer is no, then it'd be like, well, what would make someone care about this? And then it's asking those harder questions and then sort of like breaking it down. You can always get to a place where someone will care about it if you keep asking that question. Will someone care? No. Well, not. Or who would care? Or like figuring out who your audience is, because there'll be details in, a lot of the things that you're talking about that are gonna tie back to industry specific, people within your industry or adjacent to that can identify with the things that you're talking about or find that stuff, that level of something interesting. Like some people just like to watch the movie and they can tell you if they like it or if they didn't at the end. But people in film or whatever else will break down scenes and do the other things. So it's like, who's my audience and what do they care about, and staying true to that and making sure that you're not trying to tell them too many different things, and that your your message is clean and it doesn't muddy the water. So I think breaking down complex issues isn't as hard as we make it seem. I think when we're in it becomes hard because you're surrounded by all those things and you feel like, and I get that way with even like writing, where it's like, well, I love that sentence, or I love this paragraph, or I love this part, and how do I keep it all in there? But like I'll go through the exercise, I'll put it all in there and just be like, oh man, I have to get rid of some of these things. And so and then you can figure out, like, when you start getting rid of those things, maybe those collect into a different pot and create a different story, or different thing. And so that's how my brain works. And I think that's what I've learned to do over the years in terms of like when hitting, because I've definitely dealt with a lot of complex um, state government like things that are hard to um, I don't know, navigate around, because you have to make a lot of people to decide what it is that they want to tell and make some concessions about the things they might need to leave behind. Brands do that all the time with their offers or their USPs or whatever. Like it becomes um, muddy, unclear, and left to confusion a lot of times about what it is that I say. So,
And what's a USP?
oh, unique selling proposition, like they're like you could have or even just, maybe like the, there's the one thing that makes you different, or the one thing that is, but a lot of times it's more than one thing, and we don't land on the one thing, we land on 10 things.
Yeah.
And um I would do that too. Like distillation is real. It's hard. It's just like anything else, like getting to the gold, like panning for gold, really, if you think about it,
Yeah.
which I don't have a lot of experience doing. But I just, you see that just the stones just shift around and get poured out, and then this little sparkly bits, pop up, and eventually, with the right amount of, you know, wh- whatever their swirl, it's
Yeah.
called, you can get to, with the right amount of swirl, you can get to, liquid gold. So
Yeah, I've heard you say I'm probably not going to remember the quote exactly, but it's something like making things simple is really complex or something like that, or
yeah,
hard. It's
making and I'm not the first person to say that. I'm sure some scholar somewhere said something like that a lot better. In writing, we just know that you write long first, and it's much harder to write short, short. Everything always starts, pages and pages of things, and then there's a better, I forgot who said it. This is going to bother me, but um I'll find it, because I can't, it's not off the top of my head, but yeah, basically just how you would think, like your process, right? Like
yeah.
it's easier to sort of kind of breeze through, not think too much about stuff, and then go back in and like strip away, trim the fat off what it is that you have to give yourself, something real and vulnerable.
It kind of reminds me of Michelangelo's quote. He's just, people asked him like, how'd you make David? The statue. He's like, well, I just removed everything that wasn't David. And
Shit. That's awesome. I'm sure I heard that at some point, but yeah. I mean,
it,
that's good.
yeah. So, in the process, right? So you're storytelling, you got this big story, it's complex, it's nuanced, it goes all these rabbit holes. You, when you're doing that, you got to remember who your audience is. What do they actually care about? And then just trim out the story of the stuff that just doesn't matter to them to get to the place where it's actually something that resonates with them. I'm also hearing some level of vulnerability, which, is refreshing in a world of sanitized content where everyone's telling this glossy story that we know isn't true.
Right.
It's refreshing to have someone tell it how it is.
It is. I think that, and we need more. We need more of that. I think, is especially with AI just kind of sterilizing things, or kind of stripping away the human behind stuff. We will constantly be searching out for that. For where's the, that becomes like the where's Waldo now. Like where's the real human at in this, and that could be within a certain piece, or that could just be in general of like your brand or your business, for you as a person, and sort of just being like, where, constantly sort of assessing yourself of like, where do I fit into all of this, and how am I responding to it? Am I a player in this, or am I am I cautious about what I let the tools do for me? um
Yeah.
sort of things like that, I feel like are the things that stand out to me about where we're sort of like headed, and constantly asking, the constantly asking ourselves the right questions to stay as real as humanly possible.
That's interesting point. As more and more AI tools are out there, and it's infiltrating everything that we see. Your comment about where's the human. I think is like a great prediction for where content's going to go, and what the most compelling content is based on what you're saying. It's like leaning into vulnerability, leaning into being human, showing your flaws. Seems like, is it, I mean, is that the prediction?
I mean, I think for me, that's what I feel that's my prediction. Yes. I feel like, and that's kind of like happening in specific ways. We're going to get, you know, and everything looks perfect. There's a such thing as too perfect, or too written, or too, um, and from a writing standpoint, AI hasn't gotten there yet in terms of like what I've been able to like see or do. And if I do use, you know, AI to help write something, it's always takes me longer to get it to what I wanted it to say than it did just to like come out and say it. It's like and it creates what it's going to create, or it does create, is people just sort of like read something and kind of ask themselves if they agree with what's written in front of them, or if they don't. And if they agree, then it becomes theirs and it goes out into the world. But there's so many different pieces of that, of like, just it doesn't, might agree generally with something what is saying, but like the words used, the ambiguity around certain phrasing and other things, it like constantly trying to get say what I mean, say what it is. Don't say what, like the analogies of the weird stuff, or I don't know, even words like you used, what was a word that you used earlier on, about taking profound, I don't know, use the word like profound or like compelling. Use the word compelling, for
Compelling,
example.
yes, compelling.
And like compelling, even when you think about it, like from a distillation standpoint, what does compelling mean? Compelling means something to you and it means something to me, but we don't have the same definition of it. And so how do we we need to like, and this is a different conversation, but like look at the words that we're using and make sure there's real meaning behind it. And I think that the danger with AI, a lot of times, at least in the writing that I see it produces, there's a lot of words like that, and you're sort of left with not a whole lot of like, meaning. So a good exercise a lot of times is like, write this to like at a fifth grade reading level or something, and it starts to break down things more. But I don't know. Again, it's easier to sort of like write how you talk. I think that'll be, if you can write how you're having a conversation with me, or I'm having a conversation with you, and that's going to translate onto the page in a way that most people don't realize, because we're academics and these other things, and we need to write this very specific way, but you got to find your voice in all of it, and that's not always easy to do, and that takes sometimes a lifetime.
Yeah, for sure. So, in regard to storytelling, can you think of a small moment or detail that, like when writing a story, that made a difference, right? So maybe you had a pretty good story, but you made a small tweak, or added something that made all the difference as far as making it
I mean, I
really
think
great
that
content.
constantly, yeah, I mean, I think constantly in like what you're trying to do is you're finding that like what's the part that exposes you in a way that makes you, it's like you can it's almost like something you can feel from a writing standpoint, or from watching something or telling a story. It's an exercise in this it's an exercise in finding what that is. For example, I was doing a film for Gigi's Playhouse. Gigi's Playhouse is a Down syndrome organization. They have um, hubs set up all over. Well, now they're worldwide in a lot of places, but hubs just to help families um, and siblings of kids with Down syndrome, just give them a support system. And so they have them in towns, neighborhoods, whatever. And and such a cool organization. And one of the things we were doing is we were telling the story of this one family, and the story of the family was there's a 16-year-old girl. She was the one with Down syndrome, and the story was through the lens of the sisters and the parents, and sort of like how that's, you know, and what that world looks like for them. And you can get, you know, when you're shooting things with this special individual, like just like Down syndrome in general, like they're very, you know, I don't want to generalize um all of them, but this particular, you know, human was very sort of um not really like no fluff. It's just sort of like what I'm feeling is what I'm saying, and that's how it's going to be. And so like a lot of times as someone, you know, you're coming in to like trying to capture moments, you want to like be really cautious about what, you know, what you, how you expose that person. And one of the things, and it was interesting, was kind of going back and forth with them a little bit. But one of the things was the end of the piece, the family's in the car, and the Jade is the girl is she is, and they're all singing, and the way she sings is like it makes you smile, but it, it's hard to listen to. You know, it's like just it's loud. They're not like quite the words. Sometimes they're kind of like sounds and these other things, but like, you know how in like and typical like movies or films, like when you sort of like trail off and you have that like nice like song kind of playing, like I decided to use that moment and have it be, you know, have it to be her, and that made them nervous. How are we depicting these people and blah blah blah, and like, and at the same time it's like this is who she is, this is one of the things her family loves about her, and that's how the world, you know, that's how the world deserves to sort of see and feel that level of things. And I get there's worry and fear around, yeah, what you're, how you're looking at portraying someone, but I just always like, is that her, is that real, is that true? And it's like, then we're not doing anything wrong, you know. So,
I think there's just some good rules, you know. Say that again. Is it real? Is it true?
yeah,
And
I mean,
yeah.
when I say good stuff, it's hard for me to repeat it because it just like comes.
Well, I can look back at the video. So
Yeah,
that
but is it essentially, is it, yeah, is what I'm saying real? Is what I'm saying true? Then it's like, and I think it just goes into like back to like the risk things, like
yeah,
if and and just being able to, you know, compartmentalize personal feelings and reservations, um, to park those and put those aside for the sake of the story, you know, for the sake of the story you're telling and the
yeah,
characters that you're building.
yeah. So some level of bravery, and you know, just being really honest. You know, like it is what it is, and this is the story,
Mhm.
right? So I think it's really good advice. As far as people that, you know, everyone wants to tell a good story. Not everyone has the ability to. This is what you do for a living. How do people get in touch with you, and if they want to consulting or for you to help them?
They can find me in all the places. On LinkedIn a lot. Um, Kevin Willard is the is the name on there. I am also, you can go to assemblyco.com. It's ASMBLYCO.com, and that's my studio. That's where all the magic starts. I'd love to have a conversation with anyone kind of struggling with their story. One of my favorite things to do is just kind of unpack, listen, and sort of help um, kind of identify those pillars and guide, shepherd the story along and help find opportunities to point a camera at, um, as opposed to invent things that might not be the best depiction or the best like feeling around your business. So
Yeah. So tell the stories that are already there.
That would be my first advice. I of course like making, I just like making things up and having interesting things. I do think there are interesting formats you can lean into that sort of give you that. But like I do just I feel like people want real. People want
Yeah.
honest. They want the truth, and they want to see the human inside, even big brands. And I think and that doesn't come from 30-second TV spots. That comes from um, real vulnerability. Uh, Lay's did a good job in the Super Bowl with their 60 or 30-second spot, and just telling a story of a farmer. Um, and and that was refreshing to see in a mix of flying cars and horses with wings and whatever else.
Yeah, I saw the Lay's commercial, and that it was nice, to talk to them about generational farmers and how Lay's is part of
it
that.
Yeah, it did well. I don't know, um and I think it did well too. It was well received, so that was an interesting time for them to do that. I don't know enough about their business, I didn't work on the campaign or anything. So, but I think it was a nice portrayal of looking at potato chips differently, because you can be Doritos, and be this crazy fun, thing, and that becomes who you are. But it's almost, yeah, I think Lay's found an opportunity to sort of be the real chip in the room.
Exactly. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Kevin, for your time today and sharing your wisdom and storytelling skills. Appreciate it.
You got it. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.